Shavuos night learning. I was saying to my wife earlier today that this Shavuos is going to be the first Shavuos in 20 years that I did not teach over the course of the night. So that's going to be, again, not teach in a formal sense. We will be learning with various members of our family over the course of the night, but certainly it's a change for me as far as that is concerned. And again, thank you all for taking of your time. For those of you brave enough at 11 o'clock at night to turn your cameras on and share your faces with the people who are here, I thank you particularly. Again, it takes away some of the inherent awkwardness, or perhaps shares the inherent awkwardness of this medium. Our topic for tonight is what is perhaps the greatest crisis in the history of Judaism. And I say that with some caveats, which perhaps we'll come back to, which is the crisis of the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. Now, again, even within that statement, clearly there is a qualification in that it was the Second Temple. Again, just to quickly sketch out the timeline, our ancestors left Egypt some 3,500 years ago, give or take, make their way into the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, after roughly 4 centuries of a kind of a disorganized tribal system. A monarchy coalesces under King David and his successor, King Solomon. King Solomon builds, carrying out the vision of his father, the first temple, which stands for another approximately 4 centuries until finally it is destroyed by the Babylonians. And for a brief period of roughly 70 years, the Jewish presence for the first and last time is essentially leached out of the land of Israel. The people find themselves as exiles in Babylonia, only when Babylonia falls to the Persian Empire to find their way back to Israel, or at least some of them to find their way back to Israel. Most of the Jews, after the destruction of the first temple, settled in Babylonia. They had done very well for themselves there. They had, as the prophet Jeremiah had predicted at the outset, they had built houses and they planted vineyards and developed hedge funds. And so when the time came to return to the land of Israel, which again had angry indigenous people that lived there, and where the economy wasn't so good and so on and so forth, most of the Jews were very happy to stay in Babylonia, to continue to make their donations to the Babylonian Jewish appeal, and to visit the Holy Land perhaps for bar mitzvah or for sukkahs or something like that. And that was actually the beginning of what we call now the diaspora. That it was already on some level elective during the time of the Second Temple. That notwithstanding, in many ways, the Second Temple was an even more central institution that unified the Jewish people than the First Temple. And we know this because one of the running themes of the Bible, of Tanakh, is that the First Temple had a tremendous amount of competition. Those of you who have been privileged to go to Israel today, you can go to all kinds of sites in Israel that were rival shrines to the temple in Jerusalem. Right? You can go, I took a group a year and a half ago, so we went down to the south to a place called Tel Arad, right? And you go to Tel Arad, you will see an Israelite temple, again, that is not in accordance with the law of the Torah, right? The Torah is a very clear that the Torah has a vision of centralized worship, one nation, one central shrine, right? That is, as the Psalms says ambitiously, that Jerusalem is supposed to be the Ir Shechubra La Yachdav, the city that brings Jews together. That was aspirational rather than reality during the First Temple, right? That there was, and again, you read the book of Kings, you can see that there was an ongoing struggle to be able to enforce the law of the Torah, right? Of being able to create both on a technical level as well as in terms of building a certain national heart around the temple. What's interesting is during the time of the Second Temple, there is almost no mention of any competition to the temple as a place of worship. In other words, that in the First Temple, we have both the textual evidence of the Tanakh as well as archaeological evidence that would suggest that there were competitions to the First Temple. The Second Temple was something accepted by Jews throughout the world, that this was the center, right, the corporate center of worship, and beyond worship also of deciding Torah law, all came out of the complex built on the Temple Mount. So it could be that you were a Jew in Jerusalem who visited the temple on a weekly or daily basis. It could be that you were a Jew living in the far-flung areas of the diaspora, and maybe you only made it to the temple maybe once in a lifetime, right? But the idea that, again, whether it was part of your daily life, your pilgrimage life, right, in the land of Israel, that you had, and really from throughout the world, right, we do have the records that you had tremendous throngs of Jews that came for Pesach, for Shavuos, for Sukkot, to celebrate the holidays as mandated in the Torah by being part of the pilgrimage to the temple, right? So the symbolic meaning, right, of the question of what does Judaism mean in a post, or as I would prefer, inter-temple era, right, is something that was of unbelievable significance. So what I'd like to go through with you is what I'm going to call for tonight the 5 R's, right? 5 different approaches that we find among Jews in the immediate post and the centuries following the temple, to try to deal with the question of what does it mean to be a Jew in a temple-less world. Now again, it's important to emphasize the temple is a central, perhaps the central institution in the Torah, right? It is to be a place where both the individual Jew, and the truth is, if you look at the dedication of the temple in the 8th chapter of the Book of Kings, it's clear that this is something not only for Jews, but is also, at least aspirationally, a vision for any or all of humanity, right? That's interested in coming to learn the messages that Judaism has for humanity, right? That's the famous prophecy of Isaiah, my house will be called a house of prayer for all of the nations, right? But the idea that this is something that was critical both for any individual, right, who would go to be able to have this kind of spiritual experience, this encounter with God, if you will, in the temple, in terms of the offering of sacrifices, which again occupies tremendous space, right, within the Torah. And if you go through the text of the Torah, a significant amount of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers deal with the question of the sacrificial order. And then in the book of Devarim, right, in the book of Deuteronomy, the idea of the Makom Asher Yibchar Hashem, the place that God will choose, right, is a pivotal and central institution for the Jewish people. So the question is, what do you do, right? And once it's gone, right, what do you do about that void? So let's start like this. So the first reaction, and again, in certain ways less important to us as Jews, but actually critically important to the history of the world, is a question, is the approach of R number 1, repudiation, right? To interpret the destruction of Jerusalem as essentially a repudiation of the narrative of Judaism, right? That if God's house is destroyed, that this is a symbol of the rescinding of the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, right? That if, again, the logic, right, which is not completely crazy, right? The logic is, if the temple represents the bond between the nation of Israel and their God, if the temple is destroyed, right, that this is equivalent to essentially an act of divorce between God and the Jewish people. So why is this particular approach so critical? So I want to share with you as a starting point an article that appeared in the New York Times about 13 years ago about, of all topics, one of the most beloved pieces of Western music today, Handel's Messiah, right? So you come, again, you don't have to be a big expert in classical music, right? The Hallelujah chorus of the Messiah, right, is probably, I am not going to try to sing it now, but it's certainly one of the most iconic pieces, right, in the canon of classical music. So the question is, what is exactly that chorus about? So Michael Marison, who's a professor of music at Swarthmore, wrote this really intriguing article where he tries to, again, based on contemporary sources of when the oratorio was written, right? He says that the reason that what it was originally written for is the Hallelujah chorus was designed not to honor the birth or resurrection of Jesus, but to celebrate the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in AD 70. I'll take a minute to let that sink in, right? That the argument that he makes, and this kicked off a whole back and forth, both in the New York Times. He later wrote he wrote a whole book developing his thesis, and we won't go through the entire article as far as it's concerned, right? But he makes the point that certainly 18th century that the most mainstream kind of 18th century Protestants, right, certainly understood the biblical texts that were paired with this piece of music as a rejection of the Jews, right? That again, if the Messiah, here's the quote, as John Newton explains in the 1786 book, Messiah, 50 Sermons on the Celebrated Oratorio of Handel, right? And again, I must say, again, as somebody who at least used to give sermons professionally every week, right? 50 sermons on a single oratorio is either impressive or deadly boring, right? But the point that he makes here, David, I'm basically using you as my straight man in this whole feeding off your facial expression. He says that when the music swells, what you're watching is the unleashed anger of God, of Jesus at the Jews by having the Roman armies lay waste to Jerusalem and its temple. Now, again, I am not a musicologist. I cannot, and this is for sure not my field. Whether he's correct or not, I don't know. What he is talking about, though, is, I think, very, very important to understand. Because, again, a passing look at Christian scripture, right, seems to give the following impression. That in the decades immediately following the crucifixion of Jesus, right, the movement spawned by his followers fell into two primary camps, right? You had, and again, this is again among historians of the history of Christianity, what Jesus himself actually held, nobody knows for sure. I have my own theories about that, maybe for another time, or perhaps another religion's Tikkun El Shavuos, right? But the important part of that particular issue, right, is that there were those who, among the followers of Jesus, who essentially saw themselves as part of a Jewish movement, right? That again, that they had perhaps their own set of teachings, they had their own spiritual leader who they may have believed was a Messiah, kind of Messiah, whatever exactly they thought about him, perhaps even divine, but they saw it as basically within a Jewish context. And then you had a group that, again, building off certain ambiguous statements that Jesus made, right, moved to the next level and said that the new covenant that they believe was being made is actually a rejection of the old covenant, and that therefore the binding nature of the Torah has dissipated. The second group wins out, and they are essentially the energy behind what becomes the Christianity that later takes over the Roman Empire. And it's not very difficult to say, right, that part of what gave them their energy, right, was the destruction of the temple. Now, the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Jews from the land of Israel was one of the most powerful historical arguments that the early church made for the point that Judaism is essentially no longer relevant, right? That God himself has rejected the Jewish people, right? And again, nobody knows the numbers of this, of how many Jews, right, followed this group, right? Certainly Christianity very quickly transcends its ethnic Jewish roots and becomes a much more universal religion in the Roman Empire. But the idea of, again, the notion that one way of approaching the crisis of the destruction of the temple is to read it as essentially a repudiation of the covenant, right? Again, needless to say, this is not the approach that the sages took. Approach number two is what I'm calling resignation. With this, I want to share with you a passage in the Talmud from Tractate Bava Basra. So the Talmud says as follows. The sages taught in a brisa, in a Mishnaic teaching, when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews whose practice was not to eat meat and not to drink wine. In other words, there were, right, one set of reaction, right, was to interpret the destruction of the temple as essentially again, not necessarily a rejection of the covenant per se, right, but as a profound different kind of rejection from God, right? A resignation to the idea, right, that basically the world has, that the sheen has gone off of life and that we are going to be plunged into perpetual mourning, right? And again, the idea, anybody who has themselves experienced any kind of loss, right, knows that this is something on the spectrum, right, and shading into the unhealthy spectrum of reaction to trauma, to crisis, right, is to be plunged into an unrelieving kind of grief. So the Talmud says Rabbi Yoshua, who lived in that generation, joined them to discuss this. And he said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat or do not drink wine?" And they said to him, "Shall we eat meat from which offerings are sacrificed on the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist? Shall we drink wine which is poured as libation on the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist?" In other words, right, and again, if you can, I think it becomes even more relatable if we can plug it back in to our own experience of loss or experience of loss that we've seen from other people, right? That in, again, particularly in extreme grief, right, the things that once bonded you, right, to the person who died, right, that those things become often painful to participate in this. How can it be, right? And there's every time I sit down with a steak, right, what do I think about? I'm thinking about what it was back in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, right? The experience of bringing the sacrifice back as the core of the festival feast that we'll eat together, right? And how can I eat meat or drink wine? So Yeshua said, look, if we're going to take this further, right, you shouldn't eat bread either, right? Because there were offerings made out of flour, right? That were offered on a regular basis. And, you know, you're right, we're going to go, right? And so they're now, you know, gluten-free and vegan at the same time. But they said, no, it doesn't work either, right? What about the produce, right? That there were, that there were in the temple, there were bikurim, there were first fruits that were offered over the course of the summer, right? Some of you may be familiar, Shavuos is called Chag HaBikurim, the holiday of the first fruits. Now that doesn't actually mean that Jews brought first fruits on Shavuos to the temple. It meant that was, most of the first fruits were not ripe for months afterwards. It meant that it was the beginning of the season of bringing first fruits. So they said, fine, we're not gonna have first fruits as well. We'll find other, right, fruit that are not obligated in this. And then he said, well, what about water? Right? They used to pour water on the altar, right? And it says that basically at that point they kind of, you know, were a little bit lost. Or you should have said to them, listen. He says, my children, come and tell, and I will tell you. To mourn not at all is impossible, but to mourn excessively is also impossible, right? That basically, again, you had this second tendency that existed among the Jewish people, right? Basically a resignation to the idea that the destruction of the temple was a mortal blow, and to go into essentially an extended period of extreme, perhaps exaggerated grief. And that also was rejected by the rabbis, right? The idea that, again, either the repudiation of the covenant as the church essentially embraced, or the idea of resignation to the idea that we are going to be perpetual mourners, right? Neither of those are appropriate. So the third approach is, and I left one out on this list, hold on a second, we'll go to this, is what I'm calling re-emphasis, right? And that is to say, okay, we don't have the temple anymore, right? It is that we have been robbed of this particular element of our devotional life, right? So if we don't have the temple, right, let's go back to the other elements that are already there as part of our tradition, right? You know, let's go back to that particular idea, and find those elements, right, and basically take the energy that we were putting into the temple and its related rituals in those things. And this is, I think, this is an important strategy. It is one that I think is often overstated in terms of what went on. We certainly have these ideas that in the absence of the temple, that the study of Torah takes on renewed importance, that liturgical prayer, right, the idea of further development of the synagogue, for instance, right, becomes particularly important at this time, right? Again, these were not things that were invented at that time, right? In all probability, there were already centuries of synagogue life and of set prayer, but it takes on a new importance, right? If you can't do A, right, let's put all of our eggs into basket B, and other things, charity, works of kindness, right? We have a number of various statements from prominent Talmudic sources that say that the substitute really is supposed to be these other things. But that is not the whole story, right? Because the truth is that even with those re-emphases, right, that these issues are essentially so central to the classical Jewish experience that to be able to eliminate them in toto was not something that was seen as something desirable. So re-emphasis is certainly one strand of the rabbinic response to the destruction of the temple, but another is the question of to what degree can we reproduce what went on in the temple in some other kind of way. So I want to take one relatively brief case study with you, and that is the question of the Paschal sacrifice, the Korban Pesach. Now, this is, again, if you read, going back to the Torah, it is clear, right, that the central observance of Passover is the offering of a lamb, right, and the lamb is then eaten as a family feast on the night of Pesach. Now, again, to us, right, we live in a world where it's been a joke in our family and friends of ours as well, right, that for contemporary 21st century American children, right, that one of our friends who had a child slightly older than ours, I remember very clearly, because we've seen repetitions of this, that their daughter, when she was like 5 or 6, said to them, Mommy, it's so funny that chicken the food and chicken the bird are spelled the same way. And the mother was like, well, maybe that's because they're the same thing. And the girl just started laughing, like, oh, Mommy, that's so silly. Like clearly the two things. Now, again, in a world, you read I don't know how many people saw the video recently of the Murray Avenue in the late 70s that was floating around on the internet, right? So when you lived in a world where you walked into the butcher shop and you could hear the chickens clucking, right? And these things were much more visceral. So the idea of roasting a lamb may be a little bit foreign to our experience, right? When the lamb that we consume comes already cut into chops on a piece of styrofoam, right? But to put it a little bit differently, right? Imagine if there was some kind of blight, a turkey blight, right? That killed all of the turkeys in the world, right? And we would have to have Thanksgiving going forward, right? Where we would serve a bowl of cranberry sauce and a bowl of stuffing and a big empty plate where the turkey used to be. And that's essentially what the Seder is, right? The matzah and the maror, right, are there, and it's clear from the Torah that they are there as accompaniments to the Korban Pesach, or to put it a little bit differently, right, they are the bun and the lettuce, right, without the burger, right? So the question is, right, the issue that the sages were faced with is, what do you do if there's no temple, right? How are you going to have a Seder without the Korban Pesach, without the Paschal sacrifice? Now, what's interesting, let me just shift this over here for a second. Again, I'm not going to go through this. This is borrowed from a source sheet I made up for a different issue. So the Talmud already tells us a very interesting story, that there was a leader of the Jews of Rome, right? Again, there was already a diaspora. A leader of the Jews of Rome, Todos Ish Romi, Theodos of Rome, which is a good Roman kind of name, right? Taught the Jews in Rome to roast goats, right, on the night of Pesach. In other words, He said it wasn't really the Pesach sacrifice because it wasn't the temple, but he said, let's try to recreate it as much as possible. And the rabbi said to him, if you weren't such an important person, we would excommunicate you for what you're doing. He says, because sacrifices are something which are unique to the temple, right? But it's interesting, it's not just Theodos of Rome, right? It's not just this well-meaning guy out in the sticks, right? The Mishnah tells us that Rabbi Gamliel, right, one of the leading Jewish sages of the period immediately following the destruction of the temple, allowed eating totally roasted goats on the night of Pesach. Rabbi Gamliel said, yeah, we should try to, again, take the strategy of reproducing, right? It's not going to be exactly the same, right? But at least this way we are going to perpetuate it, right? Better that than we're just going to sit by ourselves with matzah and with maror, right? We need to have something to remind us, to be able to connect, to be able as much as possible to reproduce. And the sages forbade it. Right? The sages had nothing doing. We are not doing this at all. So what happens? What do we replace it with? So we have a tradition. What do we have on the Seder plate? You have a roasted piece of meat, right? And the question is, the point of that roasted piece of meat is to remember, right? But there is this tremendous tension in Jewish law over the question of, how close can you go in reproducing without replacing in a way that is inappropriate. So let me give you, I need to see if I can make this work. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me for a second. So again, it's late at night, and I'm in a bit of a mood tonight. So let me show you something that perhaps in a less serious way will explain what I am showing. If you can just tell me if the sound is working here in a second when I put this on.
Here, Dad, I brought you some nice...
Was the sound working? Okay,
Yeah.
so the background of the clip that we're about to see is as follows. It is an episode of The Simpsons from that brief period of time in the early 90s when I used to watch The Simpsons. And I have a lot of experience in about 3 seasons and have no idea what happened afterwards. But where Homer Simpson is thrown out of the house by his wife, his daughter goes to check on him, and to her horror discovers the following scene.
Good news, Lisa. I don't need your mother anymore. I've created a replacement that's superior to her in almost every way.
Dad, that's just a plant.
Lisa, you will respect your new mother. Now give her a kiss. Kiss her! Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God! All right, let's get our story straight. She tripped, right?
Okay, so what's my point? My point is as follows, right? And again, that in a much more serious vein, right? This is an issue anytime you have a situation of step-parenting, right? Where you have, on the one hand, right, a step-parent who has a really significant, there's a significant need for the good of the child for the step-parent to function as a parent. At the same time, right, if the step-parent oversteps, maybe that's why it's called that, oversteps the boundary, right, and acts as if they are replacing that parent, and again, in certain ways, it is differently complex if we're dealing in a situation of divorce where there's a real mother, one weekend and a stepmother another weekend, or God forbid in a case where the parent dies, right, that the tension, right, that the step parent has to play, because again, if the step parent says, well, I'm not really the parent, right, that is something which is not fair to the child. The child needs the person to step up and play a certain kind of parental role. At the same time, right, if they are usurping something which is not their role, it's not going to work. It's a delicate balance, right? So let's go back to the Seder, right? So the question is, there's a fascinating dance that takes place over the centuries, right? So the Talmud says that when you, at the Seder, you're supposed to, right, that when we come almost the part where it's time to eat at the Seder, right? You're supposed to say Rabbi Gamliel, right? The same Rabbi Gamliel, by the way, that we mentioned before, says you have to mention three things, right? So what are the three things? You have to mention the maror, you have to mention the matzah, and you have to mention the carbon pesach, right? So the Talmud says, Rava said, one must raise the matzah, one must raise the maror, and as when you're saying that, it's supposed to be like show and tell, right? So you're supposed to pick it up and say, this matzah, right? And then explain, because we didn't have time for the dough to rise and so forth. And the same thing is true when it comes to bitter herbs. Basar ein tzarich lagbiah. However, the Talmud says that one should not raise that piece of meat on the Seder plate. Why? Shenira ka'ochel kodshim b'chutz. Because it looks like you're eating a sacrifice outside of the temple. In other words, the Torah is very clear. And again, I want to stress, on the one hand, it's a halachic issue. And there's a technical legal issue that sacrifices have a very specific place. But it's also, again, from almost like a psychological perspective, it's an overstepping of bounds. Right? The idea is that this is something that has a context, right? And to pretend that you're doing it, right? And there's to say, right, everything's fine, right? And I'm going to sit in my Seder, right? If I'm able to, have a lamb chop in Pittsburgh or in Warsaw or in Marrakesh, right? And that is functionally the equivalent of the experience of offering a sacrifice in Jerusalem, that's not fair either, right? So the notion of reproduction, right, carries with it a danger of replacement. And again, I don't want to go through the whole thing more on the Seder, but there's a whole question of the general practice, according to most halachists, is that you want the symbol on the Seder plate, right? The meat that's on the Seder plate, on the one hand, you want to prepare it in a way that is reminiscent of how the sacrifice was offered in the temple. So the Torah says it has to be roasted over a fire, right? And so therefore that is the practice, that you try to have a roasted piece of meat, but you don't eat it, right? And we have a practice in our family, right? So we eat it on the second day of Passover. And once we're past the Seders and it's clear that we're no longer eating the sacrifice, right? The lunch on the second day of Pesach, we have pieces of the zroa of what was served at the Seder. But again, according to Jewish law, you're not allowed to eat that piece of meat at the Seder. And even more than that, right? I have, there are those that even say, again, the custom here of the Rebbes of Lubavitch, right, was that they specifically used the chicken neck, right, rather than something like a piece of beef or lamb, because it was less evocative. In other words, they said, you have to be so careful not to replace and not to, again, also not to be satisfied with mediocrity, right? There's the idea that it's a placeholder, it's important, right? It's there to kind of preserve part of the thing, but that reproduction comes with its own dangers, right? So with that, I want to introduce you to the fifth approach, right? So again, we had the repudiation of Jewish Christianity morphing into universal Christianity, the resignation of those who wanted to be put into a period of extreme mourning, the re-emphasis, right? The approach of re-emphasis to take elements of Judaism and say, we are going to look at those other non-temple bound things and make them perhaps more essential. The reproductive approach to say, how can we try to reproduce the temple? The last approach I think is the most fascinating is the approach that's referred to as Zecher L'Mikdash, right? To remember the temple. And this is something which I think is very significant. Now, I need to make two distinctions before we start. There are certainly practices that exist in Judaism that are what are called Zecher L'Churban, remembrances of the destruction of Jerusalem. So probably the most famous one, right, is the breaking of the glass at a wedding, right? So I'm sure this is perhaps the most iconic. There is no TV show with a Jewish wedding without a smashed glass as part of the display, right? Everybody knows Jews have. That's one of the things that we do, is that we break glasses at weddings, and again, that is done as a Zecher L'Churban, as a memorial of the destruction of the temple. So there, in other words, it's remembering something sad, right? And it's remembering the fact that the temple was destroyed. It's an act of mourning, right? In its own way, it's a way of, right, of processing the resignation approach. But there's a second category in Jewish law called Zeichel HaMikdash, a memorial of the temple. And that's not to remember things that were, it's not to remember the destruction, it's to remember and to create a awareness and a desire, right, not to forget what used to be, right, and what was universally assumed will be once again. So we'll take one example. There's a Mishnah in Tractate Sukkah that says as follows. So originally, during the time of the temple, the lulav, right, the palm branch, which is used as the core of the Sukkot rituals, was used in the temple for 7 days, and the rest of the country outside the temple for 1 day. Again, if you go back to the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, take a look at and kind of parse, right, the way that the verse presents the mitzvah of lulav, right? It talks about 1 day, it talks about 7 days before God, right? So the way that it was done for many hundreds of years was that outside of the temple, the lulav was only used the first day of Sukkot, and in the temple, it was used for the entire week. Once the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an ordinance that the lulav should be taken even in the rest of the country for 7 days in commemoration of the temple. So what does that mean in commemoration of the temple? So the Talmud explains as follows. He says, from where do we derive that we institute ordinances in commemoration of the temple? Rabbi Yochanan says it's based on a verse in the book of Jeremiah. The verse of Jeremiah, when describing the destruction of Jerusalem, it says, she is Zion, there is none who seeks her. From the fact that the verse states there is none that seeks her, it can be learned by inference that it requires seeking. In other words, what Rabbi Yochanan is learning out of Jeremiah is that the worst thing for Jerusalem is a state where nobody's interested in Jerusalem anymore, right? It can be learned for inference that we believe that Jerusalem requires seeking, that people need to think about, they need to remember the temple, they need to remember Jerusalem, they need to remember the land of Israel, right? So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right, again, as part of a very delicate balance, there's certain things that went in the temple that you can't reproduce somewhere else, right? You can't offer sacrifices outside of the temple. That there was universal agreement on. But there are other elements we can't allow, right, the people to forget about the existence of the temple. So we are going to institute that we are going to use the lulav every day of Sukkot in order to teach people this is how it was done back in the day, in order to be able to implant in them a desire to go back to that state. Right? The idea that this is something that we are continuing to long for, to want, to desire. Right? So this idea of Zecher LeMikdash, remembrance of the temple. Again, let's go back to the template of grieving for a loved one. Right? So it sometimes happens, again, I know that when somebody loses someone, right, where they'll transform the room the person lived in into a shrine. Right? As you don't change a thing from what it was like when they were alive, right? It's the same. The jacket is still slung on the back of the chair, right? Everything is left exactly the same because you can't bring yourself to accept that reality. Right? And again, depending how extreme it is, it can also be a very unhealthy kind of thing. At the same time, right, what Jews maintained, right, was that this is not going to be a permanent state of affairs. Right? The Jews believe that there will be, based on the prophecies found in Tanakh, that one day the restoration of the Temple of Jerusalem will take place, and it's our job to continue to seek it until then. Right? And that is the pillar of remembrance. So I'll give you one example for me of an example of this. When the temple functioned, right, we know that the Kohanim, the priestly families, worked by a schedule of clans, right? There were 24 clans of Kohanim, right? That they had different weeks during the year that they were on duty, that they were off duty. So I always assumed, right, that this clan system, right, fell apart after the destruction of the temple. In fact, one of the keynotes, one of the liturgical poems that we recite on Tisha B'Av, is organized around the names of these different groups. So the most fascinating thing is that we have very good evidence that this was not just a piece of trivia, but that for hundreds and hundreds of years, right, after the destruction of the temple, that the names of these families were remembered. So I'll show you, it's like a remarkable kind of thing. Again, it's only in Hebrew. There are These have been found in 8 different sites, both in the land of Israel. This one is an inscription from the city of Caesarea in Israel, but there are actually 2 of these were found in Yemen. If I recall correctly, they were found on pillars from shuls in Yemen, 1,500-year-old shuls, where the pillars were repurposed into mosques, right? But archaeologists looking at these synagogues that were turned into mosques found these same inscriptions. And the inscriptions are a listing, right, of the names of the families of the Kohanim, right? That this was for hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple. A Jew would walk into a shul in places as far-flung as the land of Israel and Yemen, right, and would see these inscriptions on the wall. So what do they do with them? So we have from the Cairo Geniza, one of those fascinating repositories of Jewish documents in the world, right? We have a fragment, right? It's a fragment of a prayer, right? And we can actually tell from the writing of the prayer that it is a fragment from the year 1034, right? It's a lot of specificity. So apparently this is something that was recited in synagogues in the land of Israel 1,000 years ago. Hayom Shabbos Kodesh LaHashem. Today is the Holy Sabbath. Ezu hiya mishmeres. Which family is on duty this week? Mishmeres kach v'kach. And they would have almost like you would fill in, right, which family is supposed to be on duty, right? And God should restore these families to their service. So this to me was like mind-blowing, right? The idea that, it's almost like, so on some level, right, it makes it sound, it's almost like lahavdil, like it's like one of these like weird Star Trek planets, right, where like the people are still like fighting out some kind of a thing that happened 1,000 years beforehand, right? That these families, right, and if you put these 2 things together, right, this prayer for the Geniza, right, which again, part of the prayer, which is like it's an amazing thing. They would make this announcement, and before they announced who was sponsoring Kiddush, right? The president would I'm free associating. The president of the shul would get up and say, this week, if the temple was still standing, which it hasn't for 900 years, if the Schwartz family would be on duty in the temple, right? And in the second pew in the shul, in wherever it was, in Cairo and Caesarea, right, you would see, right, members of whatever it was, the Schwartz family, right, are sitting there kind of like looking, smiling, solemn. This would be our week, right? The preservation of 1,000 years of memory, right, is something which is really incredible. Now, this breaks down at some point. But the truth is the realization that to this day, right, that we have families, right, that trace themselves back to the Kohanim who served in the temple, right? And again, certainly in Ashkenazi Jewish communities, what does it mean practically? It means you have first dibs on getting an aliyah to the Torah, right? A few times a year you get up and you pronounce a blessing, and you're not allowed to go to cemeteries, right? And these are the people that were pivotal to the functioning of the temple, right? But the way the Jewish people functioned is we didn't give up on these things, right? That we had this focused remembrance in order to keep these things alive. And I'll tell you the truth, as someone who is a profoundly committed Zionist, there's no question in my mind, right, that what allowed modern Zionism to exist, what allowed the rebirth of the state of Israel, was that if the Jews took the path of repudiation, right, we would have forgotten about this completely. If our sages were really all about re-emphasis, right? And let's say we had just said, you know what, we're going to put the book of Leviticus back on the shelf, right? It's a piece of ancient history. We're not connected to it anymore, right? The idea that there would be a parcel of land in the Middle East that would continue to have this powerful, profound emotional connection to the Jewish people, right? And where the ridiculously improbable event, right, of a return of the Jewish people to its soil. To me, I think that there is no question. Again, this is essentially part of what Hatikva is about, right? That this is Hatikva about Shnot Alpayim, the 2,000-year hope, right? It came out of the strategy of saying we're not going to give up on the temple, right? Again, we're not going to pretend, right, that we're still in the temple. We accept the idea of certain things, right, that belong in the temple. We're not going to necessarily accept second best. At the same time, the Seder has to continue, right? We're not going to say we're giving up on the Seder and that all of this is gone. we're going to find the modus vivendi to make this work. But at the same time, right, by keeping our eyes on the prize, right, that has led to really the remarkable events of the last century. So I want to close with an idea, a more spiritual idea from a very significant 19th century Hasidic thinker, Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl. Right before the world knew about the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl, right, Jews knew about Chernobyl as the seat of this this important Hasidic group. And the Rebbe of Chernobyl made the following statement. I think it really bears thinking about. He says the truth is that this notion of the destruction of the temple, right, is something which is not exists in every Jewish or human soul as well. Right, there are times where we are on, right, our experience in life bring us into a temple of sorts, right, where we feel a sense of connectivity, where things are going well, where we're connected to God, right, where we feel deep gratitude about aspects of our life, right? But there are also times in the human experience that he says are what's called, if every human being is potentially a temple, then also every human being experiences destruction of the temple, right? You come to periods in your life, right, periods where you feel broken, where you feel rejected, where you feel destroyed. Right. And the question is, right, so it's great when you're feeling like a temple, everything's terrific, right? You got your chorus of Levites in the background, right? Supplying the swelling music, hopefully not Handel's Messiah, right? But there has that, there's that sense of things are right in the universe. What do you do when it doesn't feel like that? So he says that's what Zeichel HaMikdash means. That's what it means, that there are times where you can't do things perfectly, right? And you don't replace, right? And you don't pretend that things are something that they're not, right? But the idea that everyone has to, again, in our individual lives, embrace this idea of Zeichel HaMikdash, that when things aren't perfect, right? And things are perhaps far from perfect, the idea that we can continue to find ways to continue to long, right? Not in an unhealthy way, right? But in a way that's actually encouraging to ourselves, right? That to long for a restoration of the idea that by having that sense of aspiration, that we can continue to believe that these things can be restored. And I think the last 3 months for many of us, right, has very much been a time of churban, a time where we have felt destruction. Certainly anybody who, God forbid, so many families were so profoundly ripped apart, and I'm sure everybody saw the front page of the New York Times on Sunday, right? And there's when you just think of the implications of that, right? Not being able to, getting the wrong thing brought from Instagram seems to pale, from Instacart, right? Seems to pale in comparison to that kind of loss of human life. But there's no question we've all been profoundly traumatized, right? And the question is, right, are we willing to say that we are going to continue to not pretend that everything is perfect, but to find those pieces of our life where we can make a Zeichel HaMikdash, we can remember things the way that they used to be, the way that they're supposed to be, right? By able, again, in a healthy way, being able to continue to connect to those things, right? Keep ourselves in the game so that we can once again, right, have a hope for coming to that time of restoration. So I'm going to thank everybody. We have a few minutes left, so I'll actually open it up to questions now, David, if you want to unmute things. But that's certainly, hopefully, something to take with us into the holiday.
So people can unmute themselves if they have a question.
I have a question. It's a minor one.
Yes.
When you were going through what it would still mean to be a Kohen now, you wouldn't include the prohibition on marrying a divorced or
I would
converted woman?
certainly include that also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just it wasn't on your list, I wondered.
Yeah. Nothing I said should be seen as completely comprehensive. That's a general.
Yeah, that's because that would be a given because you did that Simpsons thing.
Right. All right.
Thank you, Rabbi Yolkut.
Rabbi Yolkut, a question, if I may.
Yeah.
you mentioned something about certainly an Ashkenazic tradition of the Kohanim. What did you mean by that? What is different about the Sephardic tradition?
Oh, so in you're about Kohanim. So in many Sephardi cultures, Kohanim recite the priestly blessing on a daily or even, depending on the day, multiple times a day. Right. So again, so in, let's say, in the Ashkenazi community in America, the practice is they're however it works out. So yeah, 7 or 8 days a year when the Kohanim give that blessing. Whereas in Sephardic community, or
they do it every day.
All, but most Sephardic communities, it happens on a daily basis.
Right. Oh, okay, fine. I think that's what you meant. Okay, thank you.
Where does the Afikomen on Pesach fit into this whole thing?
So that's a great question. I'm going to revert back to, give me 1 second. Specifically. Okay, so the Afikomen does fit into this as well. The Afikomen is considered also a way of remembering the Korban Pesach. The idea is, though, again, certainly in a taste test, most people, I don't want to offend any vegans. I know at least one who's on the call, right? Most people, I would say, in a taste test between roasted lamb and matzah are going to go with the lamb, right? And there's the one clearly is. So that the Afikomen is, again, another way of trying to perpetuate the memory of the Korban Pesach, while not falling into the trap of being able to say this is the thing itself, right? And the idea being that again, there's more work to really develop it, but the zroa, the meat on the Seder plate, is evocative, but we don't eat it. And the matzah is not so evocative, right? The Afikomen is not so evocative, but we do eat it, right? But they are both different ways of trying to navigate the same tension.
We could probably take one more question. If anyone else has one.
Just what was the article, Rabbi, about Handel's Messiah? You said it was the 2000.
Yeah, it was the New York Times in. Let me see which of these documents.
I caught that it was 2007, but
yes, 2007. It is behind the paywall. I found a copy of it that I had somewhere stuck in an email, but it is behind the paywall. It was April 8th, 2007. But there is, again, for the musicologists out there, I know that there was a whole back and forth afterwards about this particular piece, whether his interpretation is correct or not. And again, I don't know enough to be able to answer that, but certainly the sentiment, right, that classically Christianity saw the destruction of the temple as being of great significance to their narrative, which, by the way, is part of the reason why the Catholic Church was very opposed for years to the establishment of the State of Israel. And it took them some time to have official diplomatic relationship with Israel, because it really is a theological issue. And there's that, like, in classic, certainly classic Catholic theology, the presence of Jewish government in the land of Israel is a major, like, that's not supposed to happen. Right? And that is a theological problem. What's interesting is that in its own weird way, right, the restoration of the Jews to the land of Israel presents as much of a historical question for Christians as the destruction of the temple did for Jews, right? And that, like, the sense of, like, wait, why is this happening? And again, what wound up happening in particularly evangelical circles was that there was a significant kind of going back to the Bible to try to say, okay, how do we work this back in, right? And that has kind of spawned a whole theological revolution in evangelical circles that, again, this is not my field of expertise, while not totally unprecedented, particularly in British Protestantism, but certainly the place where, like, Israel is, like, of super importance to evangelicals is actually a fascinating development. And it has to do with the question of, like, how do we process that reality?
Thank you.
Does that have anything to do with the church's effort to purchase a lot of the property above what was purported to be the outer wall?
It might be. In other words, like the question of, again, like certainly that, I mean, look, on some level, right, the Medrash does say that like every king in the world wanted to have a piece of Yerushalayim, right? And there is all kinds of property owned by different churches, all kinds of obscure churches throughout the world own property in Yerushalayim. But again, there certainly is so what, again, the Catholic Church and Vatican II went through all kinds of contortions and changes. It's not the same thing that it once was, but certainly I would not be surprised if there are elements of that.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is
Thank
terrific. Quick question.
Yeah.
From a repudiation standpoint, do we know how many Jews at the time voluntarily gave up Judaism at that point?
So it's a great question. We have no idea. We have no idea. And again, we don't know, but certainly it would not, let's put it this way, it would not be surprising, right, that there would be, after a crisis of that sort, attrition of various sorts. And, the idea of Christianity, which on some level offered a certain continuity to to at least the biblical narrative, even again with significant differences, certainly it's a real possibility. All right, Chag Sameach to everyone. Thank you for staying up so late.
You too, Rabbi. Good Yontif.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.